everybody hear me? Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good.
Yep.
Right. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great privilege and pleasure to be speaking to you today and to see you all after what's been a difficult year. Yes, terrible year. What I'm going to do, I hope, is just talk a little bit about the processes that have been involved in my current editorial activity. It won't go on too long, in the hope that there'll be plenty of time for questions and discussions. I'm currently editing the volume that I'm editing at the moment is the Elia and the Last Essays of Elia. And I'm doing it now. I've done the footnotes, I've done the individual works and the sort of footnotes, but I still need to write the introduction. So the whole business of the London magazine, Land's relationship with the editors, and the process by which these essays emerged, I still have to write about, and I'm still researching to a degree. And for that reason, any questions or insights will be gratefully received. It's a particularly good time in that sense. And I'll be talking particularly about the period 1820 to 23 today. So the sort of golden moment of the Elia essays. Obviously, what happens later in the 1820s remains very interesting, but his production is more, as you know, more desultory after that. So, what kinds of things does one have to bear in mind when editing Lamb's Elia essays? Maybe we could have the next slide, Felicity. Thank you. Okay, so the way that I've arranged it today is to sort of think about context, if you like, and also think about, I don't know, activities, let's say, sort of instances in the moment of production. So one of the things I've set myself is, obviously to think about the London magazine context, John Scott, Taylor and Hesse who take over the London magazine, and continue to subscribe Lamb to their roster of writers. The immediate magazine context that's created by that, the other writers that Lamb is dining with and sharing pages with. But then also the more remote, as it were, literary periodical context. And this struck me as one of the things that maybe hadn't been done by previous editors so much. I mean, Lucas is a wonderful editor, and so is Hutchinson and Ainger and so on. So there are lots of ways in which Lamb has been very well edited in the past. I was trying to always look for little niches or little instances where 20th century scholarship, our increasing research over the last 100 years, might supply us with new information. And one of them was really to sort of range across the magazines and across the magazine articles as Lamb is producing, and to look at what his colleagues are producing, but also to think in a way for the first time about Elia writing a sort of line of tradition, if you like, going all the way back to the Tatler and Spectator. As in terms of the actual sort of process, one of the things I want to go through with you today is the way in which Lamb produced his fair copies for submission to the magazine, the way he then corrected proofs, and then later on, when the opportunity came to revise these magazine articles for a book, for the first book, Elia, 1823, how he makes cuts. That's most often the kinds of changes he makes, little cuts. But how on very rare occasions there are moments, as it were, of creative revision, where he actually goes back and sort of rewrites or reintroduces an essay. And finally, I want to talk about that in the moment of publication, just because there's that interesting moment where he organises Elia's, quotes, death, just as the first volume comes out in the sort of Christmas, as it were, of 1822-23, even though that death is immediately kind of rescinded shortly after. So that's the pattern of the talk. Okay, so maybe we could have the second slide, the next slide, Felicity. Are you there? Felicity? Hello? Hello? Can anybody hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Can we have the next slide, Felicity? Please.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, Greg. I'm just having a technical moment
Yeah,
where
don't worry.
sorry. Now let me just.
Should I try sharing my screen, do you think? Or?
It's fine. I think it just wasn't responding to my touch, but there we go. Can everybody see that now?
Brilliant.
Yep.
Thank you.
Good.
There we go. Sorry about that, Greg. Frantically.
No problem. No problem. Okay, so this is about, this is the kinds of things I've been looking at are things which help reconstruct, if you like, or enrich our sense of Lamb's engagement with his editors. And one thing that the edition will benefit from is those few letters which were not published in Lucas's last letters volume of 1935. And there are a few in various places. There's a little letter, as you can see here, which is now in the Berg collection, where Lamb is writing to Taylor and Hesse, complaining about not having been paid. And this is not, this is as yet unpublished, so it's quite exciting in a way. And it's interesting. If we go to the next slide, it gives an extra. You can see there's all these figures down the side, and that I've transcribed it here for you. The figures down the side represent the portions of a page that that Lamb's works in that year represent. And as you can see, he's saying here, "Sir, I beg to remind you that you remain a little in my debt for communications to the London magazine. I've been looking over the articles and find the lengths to be 43 pages and 1/4, for which I've received 2 payments of £20 each, which is about £14, 17 shillings and 6 a sheet. I had understood that I was to have £20 or £21 per sheet, and you in your last note to me in May or June seemed to consider the account as not closed. In other words, that they recognised they still had some money to pay him. If you should still so consider it, a communication to that effect will be acceptable, as I have particular reasons for wishing to know at what rate you did engage me." And this is interesting because it feeds in with other evidence that we had that the London magazine editors were really slow with payment. This is not the only time that he complains about not having been paid for months on end. What's fascinating and useful for an editor about this is it does sort of show, we can use this to check against what we know to have been written by Lamb in a particular period and check the response, because of course, with a lot of these submissions being anonymous, there's always the possibility that he might have written something else for the London magazine that was never identified as his. There is, however, a problem that with this, that Lamb dates the letter 23rd of September 1822, but it can't be 1822. If you look down, my transcription is a faithful representation of the letter itself. He starts with August 1820, which is the first Elia essay, the South Sea House. But then as soon as he gets to January, he skips immediately to January 1822. And yet the submissions, the spaces and sizes of those submissions, like the little quarter in the April edition for verses, corresponds to 1821. So in other words, what he's doing is giving an account list for a period from August 1820 to June 1821, and it's very accurate. The only thing that's inaccurate is that he's put 1822 on the letter, which is really makes you slightly scared as an editor to wonder how many times he got the year wrong in these letters, which would throw things out quite considerably. But as I say, this kind of thing is really interesting because it would feed into our greater knowledge of his engagement with his editors. It helps us check what he did actually submit. But it's also slightly worrying that he should get the year wrong in that sense. So it's these kinds of engagements that I'll have to engage with, particularly with the introduction, and set the scene for his business relations, as it were, with Taylor and Hesse in particular, which were occasionally a little bit increasingly, I suppose, irascible towards the end, but generally pretty good. Okay, could we have the next slide, Felicity? Thank you. So the standard form or the standard order in which Lamb submits his essays to, let's say, Scott first, but then Taylor and Hesse, is that he's sending sort of foolscap folio sheets to London, and he has to get to them. He has to get them to the London magazine editors by about the 18th of the month. That's the sort of timeline that they're working towards. And quite often, as you know, you'll know much of this, I'm sure, as Elians, that there are little corrections and changes in these fair copies, little last-minute revisions, some more considerable than others. This one, the one that I'm giving you here, is from Imperfect Sympathies, which was initially called, as you know, Jews, Quakers, Scotchmen and Other Imperfect Sympathies, from August 1821. And you can see he's got to the end of the essay, and then he's realised that there's an ambiguity in the essay, and he's added a little footnote at the end there that needs to be inserted at a particular point. And if we could go on to the next slide now, Felicity. So he's realised that, you know, I can be a fellow to a worthy man who upon another account cannot be by mate or fellow. I cannot like all people alike. And then belatedly, he's kind of realised, as it were, or wanted to just be precise about what he means by an imperfect sympathy. And of course, it's a touchy subject for us today, because it's a difficult essay. It remains a difficult essay for us to compute and receive in some respects. But he says here, I would be understood as confining myself to the subject of imperfect sympathies to nations or classes of men. There can be no direct antipathy. In other words, you know, it's not the same as an antipathy, he says, which one can only feel towards an individual. It is rather a bar to perfect sympathy, a stumbling block to complete understanding, not a fixed enmity or opposition. So he's suddenly become anxious about that. And only when you see the manuscript, you see the degree, the process, or the process of his thinking, as it were. If we could move on to the next one now, that'd be good. Sometimes it doesn't respond. Oh yes, there we go, thank you, wonderful. And actually Imperfect Sympathies gives a good example of the next phase of the production process, because what would then happen is he would be sent the proofs by Taylor and Hesse, and he would have a brief window before the end of the month where he could make some corrections. And they're often made in little notes, not proper letters as it were, but little notes that might be passed across the city or posted quickly across the city to make some last minute changes. And often they're cuts, often it's the amendment of a particular word. This is a more significant alteration, as it were. And again, he's worrying about that, that notion of the imperfect sympathy. In the Jew part of my last article, I've got some words like close up the breaches of such a mighty antipathy. Now, as this is in direct opposition to an assertion I made just before that nations and tribes were not subjects of antipathy, in other words, the thing that he added in the footnote, can you oblige me by changing the word antipathy here to separation? It will give, if it will give much trouble, never mind. In other words, if it's too late, never mind. The fact is I used antipathy in the first instance in its proper sense and repeated it here in its looser meaning, as often used for assertion. So what's nice about these notes is they do help show that he was aware of all the difficulties surrounding this essay on prejudice and trying to be very precise in terms of what he meant. And the revision process helps with that considerably. Okay, and this is another, I should note, this is another note that's not in the letters. So, you know, some future editor of the letters will be able to include this material in a later edition. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Right, so I mentioned before this sort of, you know, one of the ways in which I'm trying to bring added value, as it were, to this edition, because Lamb has been so well edited before, is to try and think more, you know, in line with a lot of the best, you know, scholarship of the last 20 years on the magazines, on magazine culture, on the, you know, the metropolitan culture of the period, to look at the kinds of things that Lamb's colleagues were writing in the London, the kinds of things that are also being written in the New Monthly magazine, Blackwood's magazine, the other literary magazines of the period, the literary magazine context, in other words. And, you know, one of the things that strikes me, there's a bit of this in Lucas too already, but the ways in which we know that Lamb was reading the London magazine every month. We know, of course, he's in constant conversation, especially after the London magazine dinners begin, with not only Hazlitt, but with Brian Waller Proctor and Reynolds and many other, Claire and many other figures writing for the paper. And it struck me that this should also be the kind of thing that I'll try and incorporate in my notes wherever possible, just to show the ways in which writers are bouncing off one another. Sometimes in the past, academics have been very keen to see this as examples of there being a kind of magazine house style or a kind of magazine ideology, or that there's a sort of London magazine agenda that's being pushed forward. I mean, what I've discovered so far is really much more disorganized at that in a way. It's just the way in which writers kind of bounce off one another. So, for example, in April 1821, Hazlitt has an essay on people of sense, which is one of his railings against the utilitarians, really. He takes issue with chrestomathic educationalists. He's taking, it's with the utilitarians generally, but also with them, particularly in relation to sort of educational principles and methods. And he characterized them, and he goes on one of his, classic Haslittian rodomontades. They put the mind into a machine as the potter puts a lump of clay into a mould, and out it comes in any clumsy or disagreeable shape that they would have it. They hate all grace, ornament, elegance. They're addicted to abstruse science, but sworn enemies to the fine arts. They are a kind of Puritan in morals. Okay, it's very Haslittian. And again, what's interesting to me is the ways in which in the months following, Lamb writes his wonderful essay on the old and the new schoolmaster, which is, very different in a way from Hazlitt's. It's a little vignette of a suburban schoolmaster met on a coach, but it does lead Lamb into thinking about the new way with pedagogy, and it's clear that this modern schoolmaster is a bit of a utilitarian, or a bit of a Gradgrind in some sense. Although Lamb's satire is
working.
Can you still hear me? Yeah, okay. It's very, he's a bit of a Philistine. And you can see when Lamb gets into that groove, I'm sure he's got Hazlitt's article, this article he's just read, no doubt, in his mind. He must be superficially, if I may say so, omniscient. He is to know something of pneumatics, of chemistry, of whatever is curious or proper to excite the attention of the youthful mind. An insight into mechanics is desirable, with a touch of statistics, the quality of soils, botany, the constitution of his country. And you can see that Lamb is resisting this rather hard-headed notion of education. But I think he's been egged on, as it were, by reading Hazlitt, by this sense in which these essays are, they're bouncing off one another. Okay, if we could have the next one, please. It's not responding to your gentle touch, is it? Okay, so I mean, and this is another example of sort of, contemporary analogues, if you like, that, there's been wonderful stuff written on a dissertation on roast pig, and Lamb's curious and, very highly involved and in a way sort of over-determined investment in food and eating. And this particular essay has been a very rich source of, sort of critical speculation, often psychological speculation about Lamb and eating, particularly the way in which he, characterizes the suckling pig at the heart of this essay as a sort of child, so there's a kind of black humor or sort of horror, comic horror around this essay, at the heart of this essay. It's been noted before, but again, one of the things that struck me by just trying to make these cross references across the magazines is that Reynolds, one of his dinner companions at the time, reviews a sort of the Delia Smith of the time, as it were, in previous autumn, the Cook's Oracle, Kitchener's Cook's Oracle. And there's a wonderful essay by Reynolds on this book, this sort of book in many editions of, full of recipes. And again, what struck me, sort of going back to this book, is that some of the curious kind of black humor, or at least the oddity of Lamb's essay, could be construed as parody, because it's already there in Kitchener's recipe for suckling pig. So if you look at his recipe for suckling pig, I like particularly the use of the italics. To be in perfection, Kitchener says, it should be killed in the morning to be eaten at dinner. And again, this seems to me like when Lamb is saying in rather theatrical italics in the middle of his dissertation, he must be roasted. I think he's parodying the language of culinary books, really. And then below, you can see on the next page, Kitchener says, a sucking pig like a young child must not be left for an instant. And again, that's the sense in which, Lamb, I think, takes that up when he talks about the child pig, this sort of ways in which this child pig is being nurtured while cooked at the same time. And it's not to say that there isn't an enormous amount of such as psychological investment and very Elian humour in this, but I think it's also kind of parody, or at least it relates wonderfully to other things going on in the magazine culture at the period. There's a lovely, but also rather nasty little footnote in Kitchener about the deliciousness of the eyes dropping out at the right moment of the cooking, which Lamb also mentions. Okay, so if we have the next slide. Right, so yeah, and again, one of the things I thought was sort of a duty really was to try and think, because this hasn't been done so much before, about the ways in which Lamb's familiar essay contribution, the great Elian essays, might be seen to relate to the longer history of the familiar essay. We know how important Romantic poetry, the Lakers' poetry was to him and how much it influenced his work. We know how important the old 17th century authors were to him, Burton and Montaigne and Fuller and so on. But what about the essayists? Because he doesn't write about them or cite them very much, but we know that he read The Tatler, Spectator, Rambler, and so on. Yes, and of course these things are being reissued in the Romantic period and anthologized, so it's not as if they would have been hard to get hold of. So that's one of the things that I've been kind of constantly checking. And Jane's wonderful reading of New Year's Eve is very opposite here, because what one discovers, of course, is that the New Year's essay is a bit of a topos, that many of the essayists, the periodical essayists of the 18th century, do a New Year essay or a New Year's Eve essay, including one. Here's one from Henry Mackenzie, 1785. So might have caught Lamb in his teens, or in his. We know that Leigh Hunt read these essays. They were quite popular at the time, and you can see that for Mackenzie, it's got that very sort of slightly sentimental, backward-looking, reflective mood that feeds directly into Lamb's New Year's Eve. In my hours of thoughtful indolence, I'm not apt to conjure up phantoms of the future. 'Tis with a milder sort of melancholy that I sometimes indulge in recalling the shades of the past. And that's very much the spirit of Lamb's essay, of course. I plunge into foregone visions and conclusions. I encounter pell-mell with past disappointments. Could we go on to the next one now, please? Thank you. And of course, so the extent to which Lamb is building, sort of on the shoulders of his predecessors is important to recognise, but also the way in which he's different, I think. And that one such example of this would be the way in which quite often in New Year's essays, there's the atmosphere or the climate or the conclusion gets religious, so that one can think about past and future, one could think about time gone and time to come. But here, as in Coleman's Connoisseur of 1756, all of these thoughts eventually lead rather naturally to thoughts of providence, of the way in which this whole passage, this whole path, this whole span will eventually make sense in relation to an ultimate and final perspective. No consideration can give us a more exalted idea of the power who first created us and whose providence is always over us. Let us then consider with attention this pagan image, by which we may add force to our morality. This is the Janus image, and prudence to our ordinary conduct. Nor let us blush to receive a lesson from heathens, which may animate our zeal and reverence. Okay, and it just reminds you of the extent to which that's, in a sense, the little ingredient that one might have expected from the Lamb essay, but which is missing. The sort of, the religious consolation, or the final religious move. Lamb gets very cheerful and invokes Cotton's New Year's ode, so he gets Cotton to do some of that work for him. But it was, of course, one of the things that he later got criticised for by Robert Southey in the Quarterly, that the only thing lacking in the Elia essays was this want of soundness of religious kind of spirit, as it were. And as if Southey was very aware of that extent in which some of these moves that one might be expecting don't get made. Okay, we can have the next slide. Right. Okay. So now, no. Subsequently, then I suppose what I needed to think about was the ways in which, when the prospect of turning Elia into a book came about, what kinds of things he did with his texts, and mostly he makes cuts. And one of the things that editing Lamb has taught me, I suppose, is just what a concise writer he is, and just how much he respects concision. And quite often when he goes back and looks through his work, what he does is cut. And I think that's a sort of succinctness of style, which actually also differentiates him from his contemporaries. A lot of his other essayistic contemporaries, even the people writing for the magazines, they write long, they write much long. Hazlitt will expatiate at length in his essays. The Elia essays are quite compressed, they're quite short, and when given the opportunity, he likes to cut. He's a poet in prose, I think, to that degree. He's always trying to make everything count, but he doesn't like sort of flummery. In some cases, these cuts are aesthetic. In some cases, they're, of course, to do with the fact that he's perhaps been a bit imprudent in the magazine version. I mean, in Oxford and the Vacation, for example, there's a whole section towards the end of the essay, I'm sure you all know this, where he's talking about George Dyer. It's the wonderful portrait of George Dyer as a Don found in the in the college library of what was Cambridge, but is represented as Oxford. And in the magazine version, he talks at great length, in a way, about Dyer's difficult career, about his being, misused by a sort of schoolmaster whose charge he was under, and then later on about he's been underworking for himself ever since, drudging at low rates for unappreciating booksellers. Lamb writes, and of course all of that gets cut in Elia. He just goes, D is delightful anywhere but is at his best in such places as these. So it's allowed to remain a much more kind of idyllic picture of this otherworldly scholar, which in some ways suits the atmosphere of the essay, suits the larger aesthetic purpose of the essay, but it does cut out a lot of, as it were, the general biographical picture of D, as it was. And again, it's as if in Elia, he is realizing perhaps that D is not, or doesn't need to be thought of as George Dyer. He himself is a sort of a figure that has a particular function within the essay. Could you go to the next slide briefly? Thanks. This is the part of the bit that gets cut. One of the reasons why Lamb made the cut was not just aesthetic, but that Dyer, through a friend, actually complained to the London Magazine about. He felt he'd been seriously misrepresented, that he felt that this schoolmaster had been given a kind of bad review for, as it were, abusing or tyrannizing over Dyer. But he also resisted quite strongly the notion that he'd been underworking for himself ever since, drudging at low rates for unappreciating booksellers, because what Dyer thought that implied was that he'd been undercutting his contemporaries. So, as it were, he'd been a blackleg for the Writers' Union, and to the degree that he'd been working for a cheaper pay than he should have been, and he didn't like the implication, as it were, that he'd been such a hustler, as it were, in the literary marketplace. So, for those reasons, as well as possibly for aesthetic reasons, Lamb cuts all this in Elia. And again, it's interesting to know what to think about that, really, as an editor, or perhaps as a reader, a romantic reader, because undoubtedly, some of the raw interest, some of the biographical interest, some of the political interest of the essay, perhaps, has been lost in the cut. And yet, undoubtedly, as an aesthetic whole, the essay looks better with this, without this excrescence, if you like, which does seem to take the essay in a slightly different direction. Now, I'd made the decision early on that we were going to, our copy text was going to be the book version, and and have to live with that. And I do think it's the right decision, but it does mean that some interesting and in some ways slightly subversive little things get banished from the magazine version into the notes. Okay, if we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. What's much rarer when Lamb is preparing Elia, the volume, for publication is, as it were, creative revision, where he goes back to an essay and rewrites or adds things or reorganizes or retitles, especially with the first volume, but more generally. I mean, it does happen, but it happens only in very specific cases. I'm sure you, in a way, you know about all of this. So hopefully much of this lecture will serve as a reminder as much as anything else. The major moment where it happens is in the last 3 essays, where 3 essays which had all been called on some of the old actors, or the old actors, in the London magazine, which had appeared in 1822, get, in a couple of instances, renamed, and in a couple of instances, refashioned. So this, which begins wonderfully on some of the old actors in the book version, the casual sight of an old playbill from 32 years ago begins that essay, and that whole sequence on the theatre at the end is not there in the magazine version. Could you go on to the next bit, actually, Felicity? Yeah, so what we get in the magazine version of February 1822 is Lamb, clearly the spark had been different in a way. He begins by talking about Bensley as an actor of poetic enthusiasm, and evident that in a way, thinking rather in the way of the Tragedies of Shakespeare essay from the previous decade and in some of his other reviews, where he's thinking a lot about actors and their ways with texts. He begins there and praises his Iago, first of all, before moving on to Malvolio, and ends up talking quite a lot about Twelfth Night, but Twelfth Night is not the prompt, as it were, in the initial version. He talks about Dodd, and ends by talking about Jack Palmer, glancingly referring to his Toby Belch, but essentially then moving on to talk about Sheridan. So it's a much more freely associative essay built around actors. Okay, if we could move on to the next slide. And you can see the ways in which, what's interesting about this manuscript is the way in which it does sort of show, well, quite often when one's looking at Lamb's manuscripts, you're aware of the extent to which he might have written it all out in sort of a messy version, a very rough draft, and what he's doing for the London is copying it out and making a few last minute changes. Here, you're aware of him doing a bit more thinking on the job, because in this manuscript version, you can see that after he's been talking about Dodd, I think it is, he moves into talking about Jack Palmer and Moody as Toby Belch, and then swings into a discussion of Dickie Suett, who played the fool in Twelfth Night often. And then he's had a second thought and realizes he's not going to talk about Suett at all, perhaps because there's no room, and recasts that paragraph to direct it towards the discussion of Palmer, which is what happens at the end of the essay. He talks about Palmer and then a little bit about love for love, and I'll come back to that later. But you're aware of him thinking on the job much more than is often the case with these manuscripts. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide. Right, so this is what he does then. I mean, he produces these 3 old actors essays, and then when refashioning them for the book, he realizes that the second old actors essay, which the end of the first old actors essay had started to talk about Sheridan and Congreve and the artificial comedy, and the next essay, which is a few months later, is entirely about that, really, and talks about Palmer again. And so he's realized that in fact that essay should be renamed and calls it On the Artificial Comedy of the 18th Century. But he doesn't change that at all. What he does with the others is he takes the last old actors essay, which was a real mishmash, I suppose, of an essay on Munden, which had already appeared in the Examiner, a little passage on Suett, which may have been something he originally intended for the first essay, and a description of the Matthews Gallery, Charles Matthews Gallery of theatrical portraits in Highgate, which he'd visited, and which forms a very nice little sequence of paragraphs, but which he and it's lovely there in the magazine, but which he cuts entirely from the book version. So what he does then is take that passage on suet and reinserts it in the first essay, where he feels it perhaps already belonged, where he was intending to put it, perhaps, initially. I suppose what's interesting to me is the extent to which he might have felt that this essay, his formal sense, I think, is very strong. And this essay, this desultory essay about actors, was beginning to lose some organisation with all of it, by adding things and by not as about having perhaps an organising idea. So that may have been in his thinking when he comes to revise it for book form. So would you like to move on to the next one, please? And I think that's why he introduces the notion of the playbill, which I'm presuming, it may not be right, it may have been the original inspiration, but I'm presuming that this is actually a sort of later discovery, which he then, as it were, retrospectively uses as a means of organising this essay. And I think I found the playbill that he's talking about, because the date here is right. It's sort of 32 years earlier. It's around the time that Lamb was first theatre going in earnest. It's a performance of Twelfth Night, and all the people in there that he depicts as playing Olivia, Orsino, Malvolio and so on are all there performing. And indeed, when he later goes on to talk about Robert and Jack Palmer, not in Twelfth Night, they're nevertheless there. So that that playbill could be seen as being justifiably the organising idea behind the essay. And so in one sense, the essay, the final book version of the essay, has got a wonderful kind of romantic unity to it. The playbill, everything kind of coming out of the playbill in some sense. It's just that I think that might well have been retrofitted to give organisation to an essay that might otherwise have been a little disorganised, and perhaps written with slightly conflicting aims, because it does drift still in its book version towards the artificial comedy at the end. So the book version is more about Twelfth Night, more organised around a moment, if you like, but it still drifts towards Sheridan and Congreve at the end. Okay, so we're in the final straight now. So those are the kinds of changes. I mean, these are hopefully some of the more interesting moments in the, the editorial history of. Yeah, we can move on to the next one. That's fine. Hopefully, these are some of the more interesting moments in the process by which this volume was produced. But they're meant to be kind of exemplary, as it were, or they're meant to be sort of typical. These sort of little changes to the fair copy, final proof corrections, cuts, and the odd sort of creative bit of additional writing, which is quite rare. The final bit is really, and again, this is another unpublished letter, I think, is that moment which comes around November, December 1822, when he is assembling the essays for book publication. And there are many interesting things about that. One is that he leaves only one essay out, the detached essay on books and reading. And it's not at all clear why he should have omitted that essay, which is a fine essay and which appears in the last essays of Elia, from the original volume. He may have had his reasons, it may just have been reasons of space. But again, these are problems that you may be able to help me with, or which I need to solve, or at least have some answer to later on. What's interesting about this little note, again, and it's a sort of, as you can see, a note rather than a formal letter to Taylor and Hesse, is he's saying, as soon as you get these books, please send one to Hunt, the editor of the Examiner, because he'll be able to produce a critique alias a better sort of advertisement, a kind of puff. So it's a good place to get reviewed. He'll give us a good review. And then he's talking to Taylor and Hesse about that plot that they clearly already hatched about sort of killing Elia in the January 1823 edition. What do you think of Elia's ghost for a signature to the New Year rejoicing? And then there were some other sort of plots or some other names he proposes too. And of course, this ruse didn't last long. And what's clear enough from reading the letters at the time is that Lamb did still intend to carry on contributing to the London magazine. he was beginning to find the Elia persona restricting rather than freeing, which is interesting. Nevertheless, in the end, of course, as we know, he was persuaded to continue, or at least persuaded himself to continue. So he starts writing again. I think it's Old China, isn't it, in March or April, and Elia resumes, as it were. That last little touch is very interesting, I think. I'm very sorry to have omitted Swithin, but it's too late to insert him. And he's talking about the New Year's rejoicing essay, in which all the days, as it were, attend a feast. And clearly Taylor or Hesse had objected to the fact that one of the holy days, since Swithin's day, had been omitted. And I think that what that reminds us about is, I think that Taylor and Hesse didn't restrict themselves entirely. Their relationship with Lamb was not entirely one of business. They were quite happy to suggest subjects to him and to make aesthetic suggestions, as it were, now and again. There's a letter from 1821, I think it is, where Taylor has suggested that Lamb write on Midsummer's Day, or Midsummer's Night. And Lamb has written back in quite terse fashion, in a way, saying, you should ask Leigh Hunt for that. I don't do that kind of thing. I'm not well versed in those popular antiquities. And I think it's interesting because it shows the ways in which, people like Proctor and Leigh Hunt, of course, and later William Hone, are increasingly writing essays about popular antiquities, customs, saints' days, festival days. And Lamb did himself, of course, April Fool's Day and so on, New Year's Eve. I think what he's trying to do, though, is to define himself against that idea that that's somehow his purpose, that that's what he does. And that the Elian essay, as it were, might stand in a close relationship to that. But that's not what he's doing. He's not writing kind of popular antiquity essays, or he's not writing occasional essays of that kind. And I think that's one of the interesting things for me about looking across the board at a lot of these fellow magazine submissions, what Proctor's writing, what Reynolds is writing, what Horace Smith is writing, is you can see how much of what they're doing bears a family relationship with Elia. There are comic essays, there are essays about London, there are essays about particular moments of the year, May Day, and so on. But I think what's also even more clear, as it were, when you put Lamb's essays in such proximity, is just how different his were, and how they have a special quality, a kind of literariness, I think one might be persuaded to call it, which other contemporaries really recognised as being special. It's as if he brought all of the ingredients of a certain kind of literary magazine culture together and embodied them better than any other single writer. Other writers might have been more political or more, better at sort of certain kinds of antiquarianism. But in Elia, you get, as it were, the spirit of the literary magazine embodied as a kind of manner. The familiarity, the intimacy, the way of relating one's life to national traditions, to literary heritages and so on, is, I think, what the others find mesmeric. Okay, so that's pretty much all I've got, actually. So I'd love to hear any questions and insights that you have on any of this. And yes, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Greg. Wonderful.